Okay. And good morning, everyone. Given that, quick logistics. Given that I do have another lesson from 8 to 10 every Thursday morning on the other side of the campus, and these bones are growing old, I'll be starting at 10:30 because I won't be physically able to get here before unless I start to teleport, which I do not foresee to be able soon. Okay, with this aside, welcome again. I'm Alessandro Barenghi, and I'll be the professor for this section in the computer security course. The other two sections being led by Professor Michele Carminati and Stefano Zanetti. The course is step-locked, meaning that the only difference is your surname. The rest is all the same. Exam, material, everything, and the face you see speaking of. Okay, so what is the idea of a computer security course? Okay, better, less return. What is the idea of a computer security course? Why is it mandatory? Why are we here? Well, not that in general. Is that what we want to have in this semester is a basic formation on computer security, touching as much as possible all the aspects you may need, even if your career won't be in computer security. So, okay, for the aficionados, this course is a no-brainer. For the rest of the world, the thing I'd like this course to be is something which will give you an idea of why security is important. Well, things tend to explode, okay, point. But why, as a non-security guy, you still have a responsibility. We'll be seeing that security is relatively messy, and we'll have reasons for that. My really basic idea is, okay, get out of this to be able to survive. If you want to become a security expert, then, well, you need probably no motivations to be in this classroom by now. So the idea is we'll focus on whatever is computer security, which obviously means hosts, which is, okay, PCs, tablets, smartphones, which are the true personal computers, you carry them. But microcontrollers, the actual directional mic which is listening to us even if it's muted in this class. It's very comforting, isn't it? Any computer-based system may have security issues, and those security issues may be something worth caring for or not, depending on what's doing. So it's a continuous balance between complete paranoia and, oh, who cares? Striking a balance is important. Okay, the other thing is you'll be probably part, as engineers, of policy making in the company. They will ask you for technical opinions on what should we do now. Security also impacts policy making in some sense, because if you want to enforce decent security behavior all over the company, you should have policies which are not vexing on the users, or they'll stop caring, let's face it, but not so lax as to be explicitly problematic. So it's also a matter of interacting with what, in an old system administrator joke, goes as pebcuck, or there's a problem between keyboard and chair. Yeah, even if we're dealing with computer security, we are most likely designing computing systems for humans. Unless you are into very curious businesses, in some way or another, your computing system will affect humans. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on a point of view, humans are well-natured, tend to be helpful toward each other, and have a set of socially respecting behaviors, which, if you throw ethics to the wind, do become security vulnerabilities. I mean, this is not so surprising. It's been happening since humanity. Okay, this gets worse with computers and cannot be kept if you look at computer security, because if the actual computer is perfectly secure, but from a user point of view is opaque in its behavior, trust the user to do whatever. Okay? We won't be doing sociology in this course. There are better qualified people than I am. I'm a computer scientist. But not completely forgetting that there's a user in between, is something useful for us engineers who typically tend to focus on the machine more than the human. Okay? So, on top, well, it's me. You can contact me at name.surname@polimi.it. I have a physical office, which is in building 20. Sitting and teaching in this semester, the quickest way to get an appointment is mail me, because I'm, well, spending more time in the classroom than in the office. So mail me, and which is free for both you and me during the week, typically within a week or two at worst. The phone number you'll see is the one you need to dial when you get to the door of the first floor. There's a dial pad, dial that, and I'll be answering. Okay. The other professor dealing with the teaching assistant part, that is exercises, is Mario Polino. You can reach him by mail, or he has an office, and soon he'll also have a phone, since he just transferred. Be having also a phone in a couple of weeks, and a number. You can find both my phone, internal phone number, and his. When you get to the door, look on your left and see the billboard. Okay. The other instructors, should you wish to know who they are also reported on the slides, for the sake of it. And when I'm saying the slides are step-locked across sections, I do mean it literally. My colleagues do make it a very strong point of, we should use the same material. Okay, fine. Good. Quick glance on what we do besides teaching is what essentially is the frontier for what we do at Polimi for computer security. Well, we do what is known as anomaly detection by means anomaly-based intrusion detection. That is, you look at the traffic in a network and say, hey, this looks suspicious. Doing this by hand may cause nausea, dizziness, or in general discomfort. So what did we do since 15 years ago? We mechanized this. There are by now proactive and reactive systems which will inspect traffic, detect what looks fishy, and point it out, trying to say this looks fishy only when this is fishy, which is the main challenge. Cyber-physical security, that is security when you attach something which hits you with a brick to a computer. Or more formally, the domain of security which has physical actuators attached to a computing system. This ranges from industrial control in general, automotive systems, but also environmental control for buildings. More and more we do see electronic locks on buildings because it's so cheap to reissue the key when they're not physical, and you can unlock a door with your cell phone. Yeah, it's cheap, it's convenient, and it has a set of other issues. Okay. Fraud analysis and detection, this is in particular Professor Carminati. That is, analyze bank transactions and try and detect frauds from the fraudster behavior, because follow the money is a law which also helps in computer security. And after all, if money starts going wrong ways, that's a good way to do detection. One effort. Paper and a lot of pain. We can mechanize this, unsurprisingly. We did. Hardware and security and secure hardware design. Hello, it's me. At a certain given point, you may want to go a little lower on the computing stack and say, okay, fine. I need to compartment information, seal information in. Okay, I'll go the hard way. Seal the chips. Remove the read lines from this register. And good luck getting things out. Yeah, until you get to chip test. A scanning electron microscope, which allows you to see the chip down to single gate detail, and you realize that now you know where the wires are going. You get to chip testing equipment, which does micro welding, weld extra wires to the metal layers, and read out. And how can you prevent this? Oh, well, add photocells on the chip. After all, transistors are photocells. Nature is symmetric, beautifully symmetric. Okay, so interrupt the chip and blank the key. If the chip is open, be soldered. This can be done. This is being done. High-end smart cards. willing to steal from bank accounts, took the smart card, dipped it in nitric acid, uncovered the chip, this is still functional, and took the equipment and go back to that. This is doable. Well, if you want to buy the equipment, it's $2 million. If you want to rent it, it's $200 for an hour. And trust me, an hour is sufficient. So are they doing this? Yes. Well, typically not for my bank account, at least. It's not worth it. But for higher value bank accounts, yeah, that's worth it. You may be willing to design hardware security measures to all the steps of the stack down to the iron. Okay. Malware analysis, this is the person which will be doing the exercises part, Mario Polino. Essentially, you can devise software to do anything. Anything includes, well, asking for ransoms. It's something, well, not exactly ethical, but still something doable in practice. Analyzing software which has been specifically designed to cause is pretty much point. In general, attacks on bleeding edge technology. We do have technological improvements. With technological improvements come more possibilities. With more possibilities come more avenues for attacks. We essentially stuff the computer everywhere, literally everywhere. In the tags of the dresses you're buying, there's a small computer. Because it's so dirt cheap to manufacture a small computer, which provides you a digital signature so that the dress is authentic, that we actually do. RFID anti-theft tags go by 10 to 25 cents a piece. They're reusable, and they're using them in shops. Why does the siren scream if you do not ask the clerk to pass your newly bought dress into a curious gray box? Oh, well, because the curious gray box is nothing but a gigantic coil with a very strong electromagnetic field which fries the tag gently so that it doesn't catch fire. This also means that I can take, say, 2.5 meters of copper, a battery, a diode condenser step ladder, and have an RFID tag disabler, which is the size of my hands. And this has, let's just say, implications. Again, there are new technologies which we need to consider. This is pretty much the job of everyone in the group, with me more towards hardware and the other people more towards software. Although, you know, there's a contact area which is operating systems. Finally, side channel attacks. This has been a lot on the papers lately, because side channel attacks means that you have a physical device doing computation, and this will take time and energy. Well, big deal. What if the timing it takes to do an operation or the energy it takes are related to a secret? Login form, username, password. Okay, if you were to implement it now, the approach would be, okay, string compare between password and the stored password. And if string compare says no, we're good, right? Apparently, there's nothing weird in this. It seems perfect. If not for the fact that how does the string compare work internally? Were you to implement string compare? Well, it's a for loop comparing characters with an early exit. If character match, return the difference in the case of string compare. Otherwise, return 0. So if it's the first character mismatching, the second or the third, you'll do a different number of iterations. You lit time, which depends on how many letters of the password do match. So instead of guessing the entire password, I'll start guessing the first letter and put a random second one. And see when the check says no faster. And when it says no slower. The slower one Well, it's the one with the correct first letter. Did they botch this? Boy, I lost count of the times. Even on things you would call safe, such as digital safes. I mean, the bulks of iron with the number pad, which do keep jewels in, typically have the comparison between the numbers and the one you stored done with a string compare, because why not? So grab a chronometer and crack it. This can only get worse if you look at the energy consumption, because it's a way more precise measure of what you're doing than just the time. Can you compensate this? TLDR, yes, it has a cost, but you can. And it's pretty much my job since 15 years ago. And the last point is post-quantum cryptography. Now, the quantum buzzword is almost happening also on water bottles now. The main problem from this is that two computationally hard problems in the classical world, if you have a quantum computer. Not hard meaning you go from little less than exponential time this is awfully bad by all means. We'll be seeing a quick glance on this in the cryptography lessons. What are we doing? Change the hard problems we do crypto on. Full stop. There's no other way. A computational complexity issue, it's take what you had, throw it away, be happy, no, and try to design something which is at least as efficient. Because yes, we had solutions based on other computationally hard problems. It's just that they're either slower or have larger keys or less handy. We're doing this. There's an ongoing contest by the US government, NIST, to which Polimi, by the way, participated. Hello again, it's me. To design post-quantum primitives, or primitives which are still secure, even if someone in a basement at the NSA has a quantum computer. Or the NSA, or pick your favorite three-letter agency. I'm not particular. Okay, what we'll be seeing in this, which is a basic course, first of all, nomenclature. It's boring, but it's fundamental. What is a secure system? And terms to speak for the rest of the time. Okay. A bit of fundamentals of cryptography. This has no pretense of being a course in cryptography. It's just, if I need to use cryptographic tools, I should at least know what's a hammer and what's a screwdriver. And avoid hammering nails with screwdrivers. That's my point here. There's a whole course which dissects how to design a hammer or a screwdriver, but it's not this one. Okay? Techniques for user authentication, which is something you quite obviously want to do. It's ubiquitous. You get it every single day with login on Servizi Online. Authorization and access control, which is what you do after you authenticated a user, because first you ask him who he is and a proof of that. And when you know who he is, you assign him a role and have him do, and have him or her do anything you want him or her to do. Then we'll have quite a bulk on this section of what can go wrong, application, and by application I do mean stuff running on the machine you have your hands on, security, and web security, so stuff which runs on another machine you interact with. A section on network security, so all security just because a host, but it concerns security for transport issues. So what can go wrong with the protocols exome? We'll see that protocols were designed in a very nice and happy era in which you had 5 hosts. So if something went wrong, you either took up a phone or a car and poked the guy on the shoulder. This obviously, well, no longer practical. So we'll be seeing what can we do to achieve network security, assuming that we cannot change TCP/IP. I mean, try and do something like, okay, can we have a new version of IP? Yes, sure. We have IPv6 since the late 70s, essentially, as an idea, and it's still not ubiquitous. I mean, eduroam in Polimi only gives you an IPv4. And finally, we'll have a quick taxonomy of malware. Literally, where has human intellect gone in doing mechanized damage? Why this? Because you'll meet samples of this. So at least being aware of what's the shape of the lion, where are the fangs and the claws, is important not to get bitten or scorched. This is the economical part, but as engineers, it's useful to know what may hit you before it does. Okay, logistics and exams. The exam is just a written test where there's a blend of notional questions, if you want, and practical questions, i.e. an exploit something. We changed the structure since 2022 slightly. Cryptography now more towards practice and less towards theory. The rest is the same. So just since there are archives of previous exam themes, that the ones before 21-22 really a different shape in crypto exercises. It's closed book and hold remote exams, major causes. And this goes the same way for recordings and streaming. The school had a slide with a line in all caps and bold saying, only recordings, no streaming. Fine, what can I say? I mean, it's not like I have a choice, mainly. Homeworks. We'll be providing homework the American style, that is, practice exercises, sizably larger than the one you may find in an exam, for the purpose of providing you a touchstone on actual vulnerability. Still live. So even if these exercises are not real-world vulnerabilities, they are closer to. So if you are the security aficionado kind of guy, it's a good experience to start dipping your foot in the water with these. In order not to just have them for the fun of it, there is a small reward, which is up to 3 extra points, which are added to the exam. Notice that the exam can still be passed with full marks and honors without doing it. So it's nothing mandatory. But if you're kind of into the thing and want to have around, well, they're there, and they're nice to have. Okay, we'll be opening 2 sessions of homeworks. The first one is on local application vulnerabilities, and the second one is on web vulnerabilities. Obviously, we'll be opening the sessions after the lessons. Anti-causality is more useful. So first, we explain what to do, and then go on. What we do expect to know, well, this whole slide could be summarized as you should have a bachelor degree in engineering. Okay, which means in the bachelor degree, you had some kind of computer security 101, fundamentally informatica exam. I do. It's been a long time, but you know. If you know a little bit of something, it's nice. Otherwise, oh well, no big deal. I mean, the thing we'll be needing as scripting is one-liners. So it's human readable anyway. You should know a little bit of x86 assembly. Since you do x86-64 assembly, there's a dedicated prep. It's just, okay, learn another ISA. Why? So we take a gentler approach and take an ISA which has less built-in countermeasures against attacks. Ramping you up to full speed on x86-64 in a basic course would be probably likely killing you on the spot. So we take something gentler. Okay, there's a prep class which is essentially, okay, Here's how the ISA work, yet another ISA, you're very welcome. Nothing special. Okay. Network protocol fundamentals, the usual network protocol exam, the one you had back then. So it's a good idea to freshen up before the respective lessons if you feel a bit, well, with aging knowledge on these things. Okay? You should be able to work decently in a GNU Linux environment or any Unix of your choice. I do say GNU Linux because, yes, it's handy. Not partial to any Unix you may like, even old ones. Like, if you say, no, I'm seriously a fan of HPUX, I have 3 alphas at home, you'll be my guest. Okay? With a little bit of working from a terminal. I mean, you're strong, by now, grown up guys and girls. You can do this. I know you can. And, okay, if you're, I will be supplying side material to catch up on the WeVip website. If you're missing something specific, ask and I'll fetch material and supply it. Okay? What should you go on learning? Well, slides and attending classes is essentially sufficient, plus for the fun, the optional material. If by any mischance you prefer the individual approach, so slides and book, that's still fine. Slides only, no, because slides are very condensed in respect of what you should have in your head. Complementing them with something which expands them properly is needed. Okay? The textbooks we do advise are either Computer Security by Dieter Goldman or Security Engineering by Ross Anderson. This one is free. There's a 3rd edition which is paid only, but the 2nd one is free, and it's good anyway. The Stallings is nice if you want a more academic cut, taxonomic cut on the matter, but essentially the topics in these 3 are the same. So it's really choose your own flavor. This one is for the cryptography part. It's also completely free. We'll be doing a small portion of that book. You're scared when you open the PDF because it's, okay, enough for a full course in cryptography. Just, if you need a more expanded narration of what's on the slide, written down very nicely, Mike Rosulek did a hell of a job in making this clear. So it's nice to have, if nothing else. Speaking of open materials, it's very recent, meaning it happened across years, but Stanford opened up the course book they use for the basic computer security course, and they're doing the same topics with it. We're still reviewing it, but if you want to have a look, it's literally open and Creative Commons shared. So literally, you can fetch it. We didn't manage to add it on the fly. It was, look, oh, nice. Okay, too late. I'll be having slides announcements wherever on WeVip. So the course is already on. The slides for today and the next lessons are online. I'll be trying to have them online before the lesson. Okay, optional material. Should you be willing to take a deep dive because you're passionate in the topic, but this is beyond the exam? For the security for applications, the Shellcoder's Handbook is still a reference Necronomicon manual of what can you horribly, horribly do on an application. If that's the book, pretty much. This is a nice manual, if a bit stiff upper lip because it's from Microsoft. It's a nice secure, which will teach you good practices when you are programming so that you have vulnerabilities altogether. If you want something which is less, let's say, strict, but something more with an grassroots engineering approach, this is an open textbook with the worst possible name, in my opinion, because it's Advanced Linux Programming, and the preface says, yes, because you should know C. Yeah, sure. So it's advanced in, you should be able to program in C. Okay, if this is advanced, well, fine. Besides having all the portions of system programming, inter-process communications, sockets, whatever, if it's system-level programming, it's in there. It has a very nice chapter on secure C programming, independently from system or not. And it's, you can just plug it and read it. It's, again, free CC. Well, it's not under Creative Commons because it predates Creative Commons, but the practices are still the same. So, okay. The slides may have extra material popping up. I'll be pointing out this is extra if you are fascinated by the topic. Also, if you're really into it, we do have a group which participates to international competitions in computer security. Yes, there are such things. There's the equivalent of IOI, the International Olympics in Informatics, just with a computer security cut. Now, participating typically takes an approach which is known as drinking from a fire hose, which is bere da un idrante in Italiano, because it's all practice, no theory, with anything which this may cause. If that's your cup of tea, okay, it's fun. How can I say this? I was team captain for 10 years. And then the rest of the life took time away from me, but I still wish I could go back. And it's fun if this kind of computer security is your cup of tea. For the people here, because this is a mandatory course and it's nice to know something about security, it's probably a bit too much. So, quick disclaimer. But yeah, the group meets regularly down in the basement, essentially, of the department, in the -1 floor. And if you want to join the clan, mail me or Mario Polino, which is currently the team captain. So, to point out day and time in which they meet. Joining before computer security will really take you out drinking from a fire hose approach. Joining after, it's easier. Joining in between is, well, something in between. Okay, for today, we're pretty much good. I mean, for the introduction, we're good. Let's switch to something more properly into the course. That is, sadly, the boring part, nomenclature. So, the main point we want to frame is what is a security? What is computer security? So give definitions, and given this, how do I engineer a secure system? So not just somehow patch up the thing until it holds, but how do I take steps towards something which is secure? Well, the basic security requirements, which are by now the typical checklist, are consolidated in 3 main properties which the system you're building should have. That is confidentiality. Confidentiality in its essence is you have data, and those should be accessible only by the people you want. Whether this is done by physically detaching the hard disk and putting it into your pocket, cost, time, and pain in the ankle to manage. But confidentiality is ensure that no person you don't want to gets this data. That's it. Integrity. Something you want to enforce is your data shouldn't be tampered with, and that's the most evident integrity property, but it's not the only one. A more subtle thing in integrity is freshness. If someone swaps a piece of valid data with a copy of another piece of valid data, for instance, or in the future, that's a violation. So time is somehow captured by the integrity property. Freshness is inside there. And this means that you should only have people you authorize change the data or update it, delete it. Deletions are obviously brutal updates. Okay? And finally, availability. You should hold up this theater while making the data available to whom they are needed, when they are needed, without fail, as much as possible without fail. It's clear that you need to keep things closed and open. This is kind of not an outright conflict. You can call it brutal. But, okay, we'll need to trade off things in this world. These things are also requirements you may have in a safety-oriented world, not security. What's the main point between safety and security, which sadly in Italian are the same term? For the happiness of Italian student, sicurezza in Italiano both denotes safety and security. We're so sad our dictionary-to-dictionary translation has a collision. Okay. Safe is keep the thing with the proper damage, accidental adverse effects. The safety concerns, well, shit happens in 2 words. Security is keep the property when someone is intentionally trying to break the system. So what separates reliability from security is intentionality in the damage. Reliability has no attackers. Okay. Okay, names. I'll at least need to define these 5 terms and give you what they are to be able to phrase security concepts. So let's start probably most heard ones around, which is vulnerabilities and exploits. So, does this object look secure? I mean, does it provide of the data you may store in paper within safe? Well, the thing looks heavy enough to give me trouble with an oxygen torch for 45 to 50 minutes. So yeah, it feels secure. Until you may notice that having a look at the dial, accidentally it's worn out, and it's not too hard to infer at least which ones are the keys to be pressed. Okay? So yeah, it has awful problem of being a global property of the object and having poor composability, which is essentially the engineer's perfect nightmare. Because we want composability and modularity, well, security is typically anything but composable and modular. Most of the effort in security research and practice is try and get modular security. We had decent results, we're not quite there yet, which is sad. This is another very funny case with the frequent flyer among 3 professors, which is Professor Zanetti more than once. Security door at the airport, the one separating the sterile control zone from the non-clean zone, which has a code and the code as a label on the door. Because, you know, people keep forgetting the code, so what's the harm? Okay. The human may be the weakest link. Well, the human may be the weakest link. Okay. So let's now split vulnerability and exploit. Vulnerability and exploit are 2 concepts which pertain to a violation of security. Is a property of a system which, in principle, cannot do to the CIA paradigm, break confidentiality, integrity, authenticity. It's just a feature of the system. It's nothing by itself. It sits there. An exploit, instead, is a technique, any algorithmic procedure, if you want, which takes advantage of the vulnerability and achieves the violation. So if this is the flow, this is the tool you use to exploit, that is, the flow. Okay? They're over typically in newspapers, goodness, but even on scientific papers sometimes. between what's the flow and what's the way of getting through the flow and using it from a malicious point of view, using it. There's also a common running joke that it's so annoying when they fix my features. Literally, a vulnerability is a misfeature of the system. Okay, typical cases, and a picture is worth 1,000 words, as physical locks, such as the one on this class. You are all familiar with physical locks, I do hope. You use keys. The most common key, which goes by the name of Yale key, since it was an old patent by Yale from the 20s, the other 20s, 2020, is a lock which, if you cut it along the axis in which you insert the key, so cut it, split it in half in vertical, looks like this. Essentially, it's a set of metal cylinders with springs. It's pairs of cylinders with a cut and a spring on top. If you don't insert any key, cylinders are resting as down as possible. When you insert crests and valleys in the key, going up. To fully insert the key, the cylinders will be pushed up to a given height, crests and valleys. Okay, the key is authorized if the height of the pins make the cut align with this part, which is known as the tumbler, because it tumbles. It actually rolls. Insert the key. These guys do a line known as the shear line. You turn the key, and the tumbler tumbles. The tumbler is bound to the lock, opens the lock. Okay, this is just a quick, how does a physical lock work? Are there vulnerabilities in mechanical locks? Yes, because thieves do happen to be able to open locks without keys. That suggests us that you can exploit vulnerability. This is one of the cases in which even look at the exploit is easier than looking at the vulnerability, because it's more evident if you look at the exploits, which are sold on the internet and known as lockpicks. Well, lockpicks are mechanical tools, pieces of steel, essentially, in this form. It's a handle and a hook-like pointed part. The hook-like pointed part allows you to push the pins one by one. They actually align. Now, if the lock were perfect, so all the holes are tight on the pins, all the pins have the same size, same springs, the cut is single atom, that's perfect, there's no way you would pick the lock. There's absolutely no way you would get through. Where is the vulnerability in physical lock? Well, it's actually the fact that these cuts are not, this cut is not single atom, and the tumbler is not perfectly fixed in the cavity. So what does it happen? I do insert another L-shaped piece of iron called torsion wrench and pull the tumbler to move. It doesn't because there are pins. Yeah, sure thing. But the mechanical binding, which ideally should be by all pins because they're perfectly parallel and smooth, is never like this. Pins are never the same. There's always a slightly larger pin, which will be the actual one making contact, while the others are still loose. This, if no one goes tampering on the lock, does no harm. The lock opens regularly. But it's a vulnerability which I can exploit with two. Because I start pulling on the tumbler, only one pin will bind, will grip. Okay, to feel which one of the pins is actually binding and which ones are free. Push the bound pin gently until you feel that you cannot push it any longer because you pushed it up to the shear line. The topmost part went on top. The bottom part is still on your pick, and the tumbler no longer binds. It's binding on another pin. Lather, rinse, repeat. Move the pick, feeling the pin which has tension, push it up, and you unbind another pin. And again and again and again, you transfer exhaustive attempt on all the possible pins to an attempt per pin, which is better. And this is exactly how you pick Yale locks. It's not a secret. It has become a hobby in the United States, up to the fact that there are lock-picking clubs. And actual most mechanical locks are typically designed by people which pick them. The best locks we do have in Italy, or a set of the best locks, were designed by the inmates in the San Vittore Detention Institute, which typically do have a clear experience of how to pick a lock. And fantastic, they're mechanical marvels. What do you want to try in this case? Well, try and remove the vulnerability, since hoping that no one will achieve an exploit which is physically reproducible. I mean, you can build these tools from anything which is a flat strip of iron. Hoping for non-reproducibility of the exploit won't fly. The cheapest way I know is bristles cleaners. Bristles from the street cleaners are regularly dropped. Are exactly the necessity. You shave them in a lockpick and they work. You can try and somehow eliminate the vulnerability, which is the only thing which is left. If you can't prevent exploits from being diffused, try at least and fix the vulnerability. How? Well, this is the critical point, because the fact that one pin will bind before the others is the issue. Well, change the shapes. Change the shapes, that behavior no longer happens. One extreme is be awfully mechanically precise. But even awfully mechanically precise locks do not really remove the point, because there's always a thin mechanical difference. Or change the shape of the pins. You can buy, typically for 10 euros more than the regular Yale lock for a bike, a Yale lock for a bike, which instead of having cylindrical pins, has mushroom pins. What does it happen if these guys are mushroom-shaped? Well, you are intending the attacker feel a release in the pin. May, yes, be this one or this one. And this means that the attacker tries, says, okay, this has been released. No, it's locked in here. And he has no way of telling it because it's loose and goes on to the next pin. You can go further in having things which look like a spool, or if you're willing to pay 2 extra euros typically, so it's 12 on top, you can have serrated pins. Literally, if you're buying locks for your bike, they do have it on the label. It's just that no one reads. So this is so old that it's a commercial point in locks. We remove the vulnerability, altering the system. And we raise the cost because manufacturing cylindrical pins is cheaper than having serrated ones. You'd need to mill down the sides. But hey, that's all. Okay, let's switch to something which looks more like our regular cup of tea, so software vulnerabilities. What does a software vulnerability look like? Well, have a look at this fragment of code. Take a couple, read it, and tell me what may go wrong. The intention is obviously to check whether a user is correctly authenticated. And yes. Yes. Reading an integer. Per C standard after 1989 in all the other C standards, int is at least 32-bit wide, which means that I'm getting a number with and say, okay, if it's equal to 0, it cannot be used here, and exit. And then, after having an early exit on whether the integer is equal to 0, I'm copying it with an implicit cast in C to a short int, and testing if the short is equal to 0. Well, short integer in the will, what does it happen? Two answers. The low standard abiding one and the one which happens are both valid. Standard abiding one, undefined behavior, the compiler may emit the equivalent instructions of remove the file on the hard disk, and it's a valid compilation. Because casting larger signed values to shorter unsigned, it's undefined behavior in C. Now, compiler guys are nice guys. They do not emit the equivalent of rm minus rf slash, because they're kind. And they simply take the Boolean string and fit it in. Which means that I'm taking the choose complement representation of I, or be very picky. Since C11 could be the ones complement, snip it in half, if here is 16 bits, and fit it in. Which means any non-zero positive integer, the last, the short int is 0. It's just a matter of set to the 16th power, which is 1/16 zeros. This is 65K536, which that if that automatic and probably unwanted cast is the vulnerability, exploit F is number 2 to the 16th. Try compile it if you really want to see it running, but it's pretty evident this works. Like a charm. Are there other possible exploits? So besides the forbidden number, which is 2 to the 16th, other forbidden numbers? All numbers with 16 least significant bits set to 0, so all the multiples of that guy, are valid exploits. Because when chopped of the most significant half, will still give me 0. Okay? So it's pretty much obvious that if mechanical exploits for mechanical locks are really reproducible, you can reforge the tools. Well, exploits for software vulnerabilities are copyable. They're data, essentially. So hoping that an exploit doesn't get diffused, and that's really not a good way to cope with the thing. Okay, so yes, you can find a different exploit, which is multiples. Okay, let's switch to the other two things, which is assets and threats. We have spoken up to now of what is the feature of the system which can be abused, and what is the tool to abuse. Let's talk about purpose. Let's talk about ends to a means. Assets is what you are protecting. And the first thing which should think is that the security level of a system is not equal to the protection level of a system. Because depending on how valuable are your assets, the security level of the system will need to change, well, your desired security and your asset, you'll change the protection level of the system. I mean, if you need to defend something which is essentially worthless, you need no protection. It's worthless. No one will care. On the other hand, if you have a very valuable target, and the typical epitome in security is military level security, in which the target is, goodness, everything I'm putting on field. What you need to apply to get to a decent security level is a borderline insane level of protection, which is what the military do, essentially. Which is anything you can throw at it. But it's fundamental to notice that the security level of a system depends on what's the asset at stake and how much protection you throw onto it. So assets can typically be very much protected. This is apparently an innocuous place in the Midwest. What does it have to do with security? If someone spots the location from the photo, it's nice. But it's very difficult. This apparently nice mountain to climb. I would suggest the climb if it were not for the fact that it's the mountain which has under the mountain, not the usual Treasure and Dragon, but the American Center for Nuclear Defense Coordination, or NORAD. Because in that case, the protection was, well, I need something very thick on top, please. Because, goodness, the assets at stake shouldn't be accessible. The approach was, drill a hole in a mountain. That's a good protection. I mean, a good mile of basalt, typically. I'd say limestone from the color, but part basalt is a good protection, is an appropriate protection for this. So yeah, the assets at stake here are enormous. And okay, the protection level to get appropriate, tolerable security is analogous. So assets, the stuff you're willing to protect, essentially. This goes for anything, the hardware you want to protect, if physical damage can be done to the hardware. One very nice and curious attack is screaming at hard disks. Yeah, because hard disks, the rotational kind, the electromagnetic kind, are essentially disks which rotate at 7,000, give or take, rotations per second, the average, with a head which reads them, which is suspended at 1/10 of your hair. Which means that if there's a small vibration in the disk, the head will crash on the surface. Well, but mechanical engineers which design disks are intelligent. So they did design the disk with suspensions. But from the automation course, you know that any suspension has a resonating frequency, which incidentally is in the audible range for our disks. So if you scream strongly in the correct tone beside the hard disk, you will register failures. So don't scream in a circle, especially if you can overpower the overwhelming noise of the fans, which is not the case, but yes. So asset, can hardware be damaged? Is it an asset? Yes, by any kind of even computer science inducible attacks. Use the blaring siren of the fire alarm, abuse it to damage hard disks. Is it doable? Yes. Just tune the tone. Software. After all, intellectual property is all what a patent office is about. Stealing software, modifying software, altering the functioning of software is a good target, so software is an asset. Data in particular, because, well, data has now been the new gold for 10 years. I mean, Google stands on a pile of our data and makes profit from it. Facebook is no different. So, yeah, software is an asset. And finally, company reputation is an asset because, yeah, it may not be strictly speaking tangible or tangible by a computer scientist, so data, but it's still an asset which you need to protect. If you are a security-oriented company and you have horrible security flows, no one will buy your products. Or if you said, hey, we are GDPR compliant, absolutely, your privacy is guaranteed. And then you're Equifax, the currently largest company in America doing tax reports. Well, Equifax had a little security slip that is small, which lost the name, surname, and social security number of about 120 million people. Social security numbers are the corresponding thing of our codice fiscale in Italia for Italians and cannot be changed. The main difference is that in the US, they're also used as an authorization to prove your identity because they have no formal ID cards. So they leaked the equivalent of a photocopy of the ID cards of 130 million people, and those cannot be replaced. As you might imagine, Equifax has now a lot less clients. A reputation is crucial. And the person which leaked those data most likely didn't have a specific interest in one user. It's that it's an enormous amount of valuable data, so go for it. It's a very valuable asset which didn't have adequate protection. Finally, a threat. What is a threat? Well, what you would imagine it to be. Essentially, a circumstance which may violate the CIA paradigm. So a vulnerability is the flaw in the system. A threat is, it may happen that this vulnerability is exploited by someone. Okay, I just need one extra term and we're done. So threats are denial of service. I'm blocking a service from being provided, that's a threat. Identity theft. Identities are stolen, that's a threat. Or data leaks. We get finally to the last term, which is the concept of attack. Attack is the event where a threat is put into practice using an exploit on a vulnerability to get an asset. And now all the words do make sense. It's been a while, but we're finally there. It's just a matter of saying who's responsible for this. The name for that thing, or human, is a threat agent. So the whole sentence is, an attack is the event taking place when a threat agent uses an exploit to exploit a vulnerability and gain an asset, which is a violation of the CIA paradigm. It's been a long road, but we have a lexicon. Okay. So obviously, the attack is the physical act of using the exploit, and the threat agent may be either human, there's someone using the exploit, or mechanized, which is typically the scenario we have. It does happen that for a reason or another, causing mass spread damage or whatever, the use of an exploit is put into the form of a program which automatically repeats the exploitation on a lot of systems. Because the original attacker wants this to be as damaging as possible. We'll be seeing that this got out of hand more than once. out of hand, even with respect to what the attacker wanted to do. So the exploitation has been massive just because the attacker didn't insert stop measures in the mechanization. So in some sense, the threat agent kind of faded into the program because there was no longer an attacker activating it. This happened, and boy, if it was painful. We had internet-wide collapses of systems, which were unintentional if we listen to the actual human which devised the attack, at least at the beginning. Okay, now, a point in nomenclature on which all three professors are pretty keen, and we almost lost the battle, so right? There's a crucial distinction between the semantics of hacker and attacker. What's the point? Well, hacker is a term which originated, well, besides among woodworkers, a hacker is a person cutting wood with an axe. Okay, but this is not the context. It was a nickname for a person being able to use all the features of the systems it had in front of, regardless of the system. It started with railroad models, with model trains. Okay? And a hacker was a person, back at MIT in 1952, which had very nice dioramas in which trains in the diorama ran according to the actual timetables of Boston, because they encoded the algorithm for the timetables with mechanical relays on the bottom of the diorama. Now, it's a technical stunt, and it shows that you know how to compose relays well beyond what they did in the coursework at MIT in 1950s. It's knowledge of a system so extensive that you do something which is beyond the usual use for almost everyone. And the label back then was the one of a hacker. So it's essentially, okay, you know your stuff very well, so well that you can do something quite unexpected. This, with computer systems and the Turing bless and curse, a Turing machine can do anything. Oh boy, there are no frontiers. If I know my stuff, I can do anything. This was the original term, and it was up to when abusing the system creatively, so building exploits for vulnerabilities, is sure thing something which needs a deep knowledge of the system and creativity. So in the early prehistory of computer security, it was hackers who typically found vulnerabilities because they were just, okay, toying around, essentially. There was no malice. It was just, hey, look, this is very weird, is it? And it was for bragging rights. It was not to cause damage. So it was not a threat to an asset. And then the thing kind of stuck and blended with actual people turning from fun to malice. And sadly, the newspapers mostly stuck with hacker being a synonym for an attacker. So for someone which actually has a hacking skill and misuses it to build exploits and use them to exploit vulnerabilities. This has gone so far as we have the reversal. Exploits are mechanizable, diffusable, copyable, goodness, they're programs. So that we have non-hacker people being attackers. Because you can just take the exploit and throw the thing at the system and it will crack it. Okay? So this is really a misnomer, and it's nice if, well, people having a basic computer security course have a clear split. So please, in your own lexicon, choose the correct term. You'll see so many abuses that it's almost a lost cause, but you know. Not saying this here would be a lost cause. Okay. What does then a security professional, a security engineer in some sense look like? Well, it's a person able to identify vulnerabilities, which may focus on developing exploits, because the typical case is if you just have a vulnerability, but the system is so complex that there's no exploit for that, meaning you have that cost, but the user doesn't control the integer, there may be a vulnerability in principle, which is not exploitable. This with highly complex software happens, because the user input doesn't get everywhere. So it may be the case. So when you find a vulnerability, before starting to scream around, essentially, you try and see if it's exploitable, because the cost of fixing that may be in performance very high. And if it's non-exploitable, you may be better off leaving it there. Develop methods to do attack or exploitation detection methods. So as an engineer, you may want to develop tricks to see whether something is going on. Develop countermeasures, which is the main problem. If there's a thing which is sorely lacking in computer security, and I'm so sorry on what we as old people left you young people, it's that the current state of software security is what I can gently define as a dumpster fire. Why? Because security has been for decades an afterthought. First, get the system to be working, and then working even if someone tampers it. This is not the way to go. Because if security is an afterthought, you're plugging holes in a colander one by one. Yeah, the colander eventually becomes a pot. It will take you time. But if you need a pot, design a pot, not a colander. And it's terrific because in computer security, flaws are not evident. I mean, why doesn't this happen in other engineering disciplines? Why are civil engineers less concerned with security? Because goodness, if a building has a 10 meters crack in the border wall, I, who am not an engineer, a civil engineer, have a look at the crack and say, you know, I won't be entering just in case. So flaws, vulnerabilities in other engineering domains are self-evident to the user of the product. In computer security, vulnerabilities are really not self-evident to the end user. It's only people having affirmation in computer science and at least a brush on security which will spot them, which is why this course is here, essentially. Because otherwise, you can sell applications which are really full of vulnerabilities, and the end user won't complain until there's a problem, until someone exploits them, does an actual damage to an asset, and users come with pitchforks and torches at you. So yes, this point is why for decades security was an afterthought. I can confidently say that in the last decade and a half, this has been constantly shifting towards security by design. We're not there yet, mainly because we have a lot of legacy. Computer systems are eternal. Hardware fails, software doesn't. Software does not rot. Which means that we have programs in COBOL, the first programming language, in absolutely non-critical things, such as bookings for airplanes, managing your bank accounts and bank transfers, so something which is absolutely non-critical. This code has been written in the late 50s, late 1950s, by people which for biological reasons may no longer be available, and which didn't have the least care about security. Boys, you're very welcome. This is kind of a mess, and I really wish it wasn't. We're still fixing it, and this is why we had a mandatory course in computer security. So that if your job is not, as a vocation, fix the mess, at least it's not add up to the pile. Okay, the last thing I'll be mentioning is that since this is an engineering problem, the thing the management will want is figures with economic risks, because, you know, it's the management. Okay? So one thing they'll ask you is to quantify what is the security risk in terms of money, essentially, potentially lost. And the idea is that very coarsely, the risk you're exposed to is a combination of how much is at stake, what's the extent of the vulnerabilities being present, and the threats you're facing. Now, what's at stake? Well, typically you know it because it's your stuff. Okay, it's nice sometimes to point out to the management that something is an asset, because sometimes digital assets, being incorporeal, tend to be not that evident. And reputation is the least evident one. So that's the point. And evaluating the value of an asset, well, it's easy for physical stuff. You know the price of the hardware. It's less easy to evaluate the price of the data you have, but you can. The reputation is kind of priceless with the management. The extent of the vulnerabilities. Well, by definition, you can evaluate this if you know how many of these guys are there. But if you knew them, you could fix them. So what do you do? Well, typically there are metrics, which are statistical metrics of how full of holes is a piece of software, depending on the software development practices you follow. There's a branch in software engineering, which is what's the number of expected, not bugs, but vulnerabilities, so security-relevant bugs, you have per lines of code. And then you know how many lines of code you have. Okay, it's not the exact number, but if you have 10 million lines of code of a software, that's statistically close enough to average. Sure, the Chernoff bound will tell you that, okay, that's far, but not too far. So you can evaluate what's the likelihood of someone finding a vulnerability, developing an exploit, and getting through. The threats are kind of independent, meaning that, okay, besides obviously antagonizing someone, which, okay, it's creating a threat, and, well, there are, besides bribery or being very gentle, there are not direct means to remove threats, essentially, because it's someone which has the intention of causing you harm. So it's either you're very kind or you pay him. Typically, it goes those two ways, essentially, or convince him in one of the two ways. So threats are kind of independent from what you can do. Yeah, be sure not to intentionally cause them, but that's pretty much it. Okay, balancing what's the amount of cash at risk, which is this whole thing, by the probability of getting someone to develop an exploit and getting through, by how many people will try to exploit you, very roughly, will give you, well, an amount of money. People in management do actually have numbers for this. As exact science engineers, we are typically having scheme creep when we see them because it's kind of heuristic. The fun fact is that they don't go very much far from the target when you look at actual accidents. So even if it's very, well, you know, yeah, that's kind of an estimate, that's not too horrible. Because security is a balance, because having security measures, having protections in place has a cost. Let's face it, it's extra equipment or development time or human code review time has a cost. And if you pay more than what you're protecting, you have an economic loss. You may be very happy as an engineering standpoint because it's protected now. It has the proper level of security, but the management won't listen to you. Okay, so you'll need to manage costs, direct and indirect. Quick recap. Direct costs. Well, if you need to add extra procedures in your firm, it's a cost. You'll spend more time in boring stuff than on fun stuff. Time is paid, so it's a cost. Operational costs. I do want to have my backups locked in a safe. It's something that some people do because, well, a good 10 inches of metal is good for accidental fires. True. And then you need a system administrator that every Friday evening goes back to the tape station, pulls the tapes, and slams them in a safe. It's an operational cost. An equipment cost. I want to install a host on the network which just filters traffic and drops the invalid things. It's a firewall, essentially. Okay, I need to buy the host. That's it. Okay. Indirect costs, which are typically not so evident, and this is especially the case for security, are lesser usability. Somehow asking for continuous authentication to the users annoys the users. Annoys the users and steals time from the users. So, okay, authenticate them, but maybe asking the password every 10 minutes, it's above the line. Slower performance, more checks, less operations dedicated to something meaningful. Okay? Kind of less privacy, although in the last years we are able to manage this. Before the birth of certain specific cryptographic techniques, more checks on the rights of the users really meant looking at the full identikit of the users. We can now compartment this, but in most systems, this is not worth the effort. So yeah, check more, read more private data. And yeah, if the users are slowed down by type a 100 characters password, they will be slower. No dice. So typically, especially after a course in computer security, you tend to drift towards the paranoid side. Remember that users will bite you, and they're not completely wrong. One very fundamental tenet which you will need to nail into the head of the management is that you cannot just buy security. This will be very painful, and you have my sympathies. I do the same thing regularly. Why? Because think of, you have bought a very expensive firewall, the kind of 100 to 150 kilo euros. Okay, you can filter in real time 400 gigabits of traffic per second. They sell them, they're this size, are even rather cheap on the power bill. And you don't configure it. Besides being a criminal, essentially, this is a gigantic cost with no security. Paradoxically, with less security than not having it. Because the illusion of there's a very expensive firewall convinces you that it's better than not having it. No, it's the opposite if it's configured. And even if my hope is you won't, you will likely find firms in which this happens. We have network security issues. No, we bought a firewall. You bought it, and that's it. Good, but likely not good enough. Why? Because the regulation says I should have a firewall, not have it configured. So I bought a firewall. Awful? Yes. Same thing. Mandate passwords which are 30 characters long and contain numbers, letters, squirrel noises, and the users will swear first, generate a password, write it in a post-it note, stick the post-it note on the bottom of the screen, and leave it there. And there goes the authentication. There are countless examples of blunders in this sense. The most blatant and recent and sad one was the medical support people during the pandemic having the login and password as operator onto the emergency system stuck on a monitor, and people from the TV accidentally catching that in a frame. And that really sucked, to put it bluntly. Yeah, so more money, more effort, more security. No, it's not an equation. The most blatant one, the most lovely one, and the most hopeful one is airport security. Airport security has a ton of mishaps in this sense. The most notable one is liquids. If you've ever flown, you'll be knowing that you can carry in your carry-on baggage, the one you have with you in the cabin, only a limited amount of liquids, and they should be in separated bottles. Why this? Because someone said, "Hi, but a potential threat is someone bringing a toxic compound, a two-phase toxic compound, I can think of 3 or 4, of which the components are harmless, but you can combine them in the cabin and obtain poisonous gas or liquid. Okay, so split the liquids, diminish the size, and have them bagged separately and checked. Does it make sense? Yes, if this were the main threat. If the likelihood of this happening was high enough. This very nice comic, and it's not the last one from this author, he's an ex-JPL in NASA, turned comic artist, says, okay, listen, you know, you took my water bottle because it's above whatever limit, but I still have my battery from the laptop, which is about 200 to 300 grams of lithium. Lithium is highly flammable in air, in humid air. So tear open the battery, and you have a sizable fire, which, if doused with water, will get worse, because lithium splits water into hydrogen and oxygen, which then catch fire in the optimal mixture, which causes the explosion, which in mines we use to breach quartz. And all of a sudden, you do realize why Amazon mails separately stuff with lithium batteries. But lithium batteries are not checked. And they're way more common than you, I don't know, mixing, for instance, chlorine-based compounds and on strong bases, which will give you gaseous chlorine, which is highly toxic. Not just to spill the open formula on a classroom. So yeah, but batteries aren't checked. So yeah, airport security is a trove. Professor Danero has an enormously long list of blunders on how can you mismatch your risk assessment and put in place protections which slow down checks, annoy users, and do little to no benefit. Okay. So where do we put an end to our paranoia? Essentially, what's the extent of threats we should consider reasonable and what is not reasonable? It's a matter of trust. Trustworthiness and trust assumptions are the points which delimit somehow the area of threats you're willing to consider. Meaning that if something is trusted, it means that you decided that this won't be a concern. If something is trustworthy instead, it means that the object is so well built that it has no threats. Mixing them leads to chaos. Trust is something you give to a system because you deem the threats small enough or negligible. Trustworthiness is a property of the system which tells you, look, this is ironclad. Don't mix them. Okay? In any system, you have a set of trusted elements. So elements on which you decide that nothing bad is going to happen. Which ones is up to you, ultimately. So do you trust, for instance, the software you installed? I mean, you downloaded a string of bytes which is now running on your PC or smartphone. Do you trust it? Well, it's coming from Google Play Store or Apple Store. It has been checked, likely yes. I fetched it from an obscure corner of the network, and I don't know the author. I'll probably inspect the source if it's available, or just not run it. Do you trust your own code? You write a service for your firm. Do you trust it to be exempt from vulnerabilities? Well, that pretty much depends on your own paranoia. But after all, you're not running your own code. Come and think of it. You are running the translation done by the compiler of your code, unless you're writing raw binaries, which is doable. Painful. I mean, I went through printf in machine code once, and it's something I do not fondly remember. But unless you write machine code, you're trusting the compiler. And the code which is resident and running from the BIOS, and the hardware running this. At a certain point, you need to stop. And the typical case is, well, I'll trust the hardware, save for very critical systems. I'll kind of trust the BIOS. You can work on computers which have completely open source inspectable BIOSes. One is Core Boot, what's the name of it? And you can have it. You can even remove the blobs of code which you typically do not know they're running, but which Intel runs to do management. Or your laptops, if they are Intel-based, do have two operating systems running. One is the one you installed. The other is Minix, the one from Andy Tannenbaum, the example from the OS course. Because your chipset has an independent computer, which is running a closed source version of Minix, compiled by Intel, put it there, and it has network access. You are now very happy, and you trust a lot Intel, or at least this was trusted, even if trustworthiness is arguable, by all of you. Was this subject of vulnerabilities being found? Yes. This system is used to do remote management of laptops in firms. So it's not just an operating system with an extra CPU, which you don't see, connected to a network card, which shares the wires with yours, but which you cannot access. Fantastic. But it runs a web server for the remote maintenance. And the remote server had a user authentication for the administrator. Goodness, it's Intel, the responsible people. Fun fact, you could send admin as a user, and any wrong password didn't let you in. Okay, just send the user field, forget about sending the password. And due to vulnerability in the code of the internal management, you got in as full administrator. Intel said, we're so sorry, it's an overlook. An overlook in the most highly prized vulnerability in 12 years, I think. But we did trust Intel. And we mostly still are. Mostly. Probably now a little bit less, but okay. The ultimate point in horror was put forward by the good old Ken Thompson. Yeah, it's the Ken Thompson from Ritchie and Thompson, the two people who invented Unix. Turing Award back then, he chose a curious point in the Turing Award intervention, which you usually give, which is reflection on trusting trust. That is, compilers are a devious kind of software. I do love them. I have a compiler background, but they're a devious kind of software because it's software generating software, after all. Okay, what if I Trojanize a compiler? That is, I devise a compiler which compiles any source code I want correctly, save from one source code in which it injects a Trojan, and also detects when it's compiling a compiler and propagates this modification in the binary. That is, takes the source code of the compiler and adds back this modification. Now I do have a compiler, which being used to compile other compilers will infect them only in the binary. So you either read the binary of GCC, an experience I wouldn't recommend, or you won't be spotting this. And this compiler will do everything right, save for inserting a specific vulnerability. How do I get across this? I do rewrite a compiler from scratch from machine code. Is this painful? Boy, yes. Did they do it? Yes. Bootstrapable.org is a project in which you have a readable Lisp interpreter in machine code. And then the Lisp interpreter can run a small compiler written in Lisp, which compiles C, with which you compile a C compiler, which again compiles C, and you have the whole chain, which is trusted. It's an exercise karma cleanup to read all this. But if you really, really, really are paranoid, you can go that way too. So is it possible to bootstrap a trusted compiler? Yeah, it takes reading a binary Lisp interpreter, not too large, the Lisp code of a C compiler, and then the C code of a C compiler, and you're done. But this, yes, has been done. And it's probably the pinnacle of mistrust. Okay, we're good. So by now, you should have cleared that this will be a long set of engineering problems. From tomorrow on, we'll start tackling them.